This story is titled, My Wife Humiliated Me in Front of Everyone with Her Story That Made Them All Laugh. But when she turned around, she only found an empty chair. I had already left and never came back. Hey Reddit, my name is Tyler, and I'm 29 years old. There was something unsettling about that Tuesday night. A weird tension hanging in the air, like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I hadn't actually meant to show up late to the show. To be honest, I'd been debating whether to even go at all. The comedy night was something my wife Melanie had been hyping up for weeks. It was her big debut at this downtown venue, though she kept insisting she was totally not nervous about it. Anyone could see through that facade. She'd been jittery for days leading up to it, rehearsing her material in front of the bathroom mirror and laughing alone in the kitchen at her own jokes. What really caught my attention was how her phone kept lighting up with texts from someone named Stacy, way more often than seemed normal. I knew something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, I was already 7 minutes late. The show had started without me. My hand stayed gripped on the steering wheel longer than necessary as the engine ticked quietly in the silence. I just sat there with the headlights off, staring at the entrance of the little brick bar that was nestled between a vape shop and a pizza place that never seemed to close, no matter what time of day you drove by. I could hear laughter booming from inside the venue, and someone banged on a table in appreciation. My heart was ticking like a slow metronome as I finally forced myself to get out of the car. There was no fanfare, no deep breath to steel myself. Just a grim shuffle toward the door where a guy with a clipboard barely looked up before waving me inside. By the time I made it through the entrance, it was already too late. The damage, whatever it was going to be, was already in motion. Inside, the lights were dimmed low, and the crowd was thick with strangers leaning into one another. Their faces were illuminated by the stage lights and the occasional glow of phone screens as people recorded snippets of the performances. I decided to stay at the back in the shadows, not wanting to draw attention to my late arrival. From my position, I watched as Melanie held court up front like she was born to be on that stage. Her hair was loose and wild, her eyes gleaming under the spotlights. She had a glass of wine in her hand that seemed to be part of her outfit, like a carefully chosen accessory. And that laugh, God, that laugh. My wife's signature laugh echoed through the room like a blade being drawn in public, sharp and attention-grabbing. So I told him, "If you're going to text your mom that much, maybe marry her," she said with perfect comedic timing, and the room absolutely erupted in laughter. I didn't laugh. Hell, I didn't even flinch. But something deep inside me shifted, like drywall starting to crack under pressure that it was never meant to carry. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "And you know what's really sexy?" she asked the audience, pausing for dramatic effect. "A man who knows when to stay out of your messages." The line landed like a grenade going off. The laughter was louder this time, accompanied by genuine applause. There was this one guy near the front row wearing a dark blue sweater who leaned back in his chair like he belonged in her story somehow. He let out a whistle that was too comfortable, too smug, like he was in on some private joke. I watched the moment when her eyes drifted past the crowd, clearly looking for the reserved seat with my name on it, the seat that was empty. That's when she finally saw me standing there in the back. No smile, no drink in hand, just staring at her with what I can only imagine was a completely unreadable expression. Her face faltered for just a split second, a crack in the performance mask. But then, the entertainer persona returned full force. She tossed her hair and said something snarky about needing thicker skin if you're going to be with a funny woman. The audience laughed again, completely blind to the tremor I could hear lurking behind her voice. I turned around and left before her set even ended. I didn't speed home like some dramatic movie scene, and I didn't cry either. I just drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on my thigh, my fingers twitching like they were searching for something to hold on to. The silence in the car was somehow louder than all the noise back at the bar had been. When I got back home, the house felt completely sterile. All the lights were off, there was mail scattered on the counter, and the hallway carried that faint scent of lavender spray, the kind Melanie used when she didn't want to shower, but wanted it to seem like she had. I sat down on the edge of our bed, watching the clock blink 11:23 p.m. in the darkness. My eyes kept drifting to her phone charger, this threadbare thing she always kept beside her pillow. Suddenly, the screen of her iPad lit up for a second in the dark room. A text notification had come through. "You killed it," from a contact simply named C. I didn't touch the device. I didn't need to. I'd seen enough. Exactly 21 minutes later, I heard the front door open. Her keys jangled against each other, and her heels tapped decisively on the tile floor, loud and purposeful, like someone announcing their presence to the world. When she walked into the bedroom, there was a flush to her cheeks and a satisfied hum in her throat, the kind you get after a successful performance. She didn't notice me sitting there in the dark until she flicked on the hallway light. "Tyler," she blinked, clearly startled. "You're home already?" I didn't answer her question. She tilted her head, and I could see her smile twitching with uncertainty. "What, you left early?" she asked, fishing for information. Still, I remained silent. She stepped closer, and I could smell the wine still lingering on her breath. "What's the deal, babe? It was just jokes," she said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the defensiveness creeping into her voice. I stood up slowly, keeping my face completely unreadable. When I finally spoke, my voice came out low and flat. "Who's C?" She froze completely, and that's where everything really began to unravel. Her body stiffened like she'd been caught stepping out of someone else's skin. The hallway light carved a harsh shadow across her face, slicing it into two distinct expressions: confusion on one side and something else on the other, something that moved too quickly for me to name or understand. "See?" she repeated, but the word came out too fast and too loud. "You're spying on my messages now?" I didn't move, didn't even blink. "I didn't touch your phone," I said calmly. "It lit up, that's all." She let out a sharp, defensive laugh that sounded nothing like the confident performer I'd just watched on stage. "God, Tyler, it's probably Courtney or Caleb," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You're being paranoid again." Paranoid again. Those two words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd heard that exact phrase more times in the last 8 months than I had during our entire marriage combined. It had become her favorite piece of armor. Make me feel crazy. Make me doubt what I already knew deep down was true. I turned away from her and walked into the kitchen, flicking on the overhead light. The sink was full of wine glasses with lipstick stains around the rims. One of them still had a faint fingerprint near the edge, like evidence of a crime scene. She followed me, her voice tight with forced enthusiasm. "I killed it tonight," she announced. "People loved me." Then her tone shifted, becoming accusatory. "And instead of being proud of me, you're in here sulking like I cheated on you or something." The silence that followed hit harder than anything either of us had said so far. "I asked you who C is," I repeated, slower this time, letting each word hang in the air. She scoffed and threw her hands up in exasperation. "You're acting like a lunatic. Do you hear yourself? You're interrogating me over a text with an emoji." I looked at her then. Really looked at her and noticed details I'd been trying to ignore. The trembling in her hands. The slight stagger in her weight distribution. The way her eyes wouldn't land on mine and stay there. "I saw you wink at him," I said quietly. "The guy in the front row with the navy sweater, you looked right at him." Melanie's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. A pause stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap. Finally, she managed to speak. "You're jealous of a fan now? Is that where we're at? You couldn't even clap for me, and now you're inventing some romance novel subplot with a random dude in the audience. Do you know how you sounded up there?" I asked, the words scraping against my throat. "Do you even hear yourself anymore?" Her eyes narrowed into slits. "I was performing. It's called a bit, Tyler. Grow up." I walked past her toward the bedroom without another word. She didn't follow me immediately, but I could hear her footsteps later. Softer this time. Hesitant, like she was trying to figure out the right approach. When she finally came into the room, she sat on the edge of the bed like a teenager waiting for a scolding from their parents. I didn't look at her. I just pulled off my shirt and folded it neatly, more out of habit than any conscious decision. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. "I'm not stupid," I said after a long while, my voice cutting through the quiet. "I never said you were," she replied softly. "Then stop treating me like I am." Melanie looked down at her knees, her confidence from earlier completely evaporated. "There's nothing going on," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. Another beat passed between us, heavy with unspoken truths. "But there was, wasn't there?" I said, not really asking a question so much as stating what we both knew. That did it. Her shoulders tightened like someone had just yanked a rope attached to her spine. She looked up at me, and for the first time that night, the mask completely dropped. She didn't look vulnerable. She looked cornered. "It was nothing," she said quickly. "One time, a stupid mistake that happened months ago, I ended it." My heart didn't stop beating. It didn't even skip. It just went completely quiet, like it had turned inward to listen to something I couldn't quite hear yet. "Who is he?" I asked. She looked away from me, staring at the wall. See, she nodded, confirming what I already suspected. I felt my body physically shift backward, like the air in the room had suddenly become too thin to breathe properly. And you made jokes about me tonight, I said, the pieces finally clicking together in my mind. I didn't think you'd be there, she whispered. Somehow, that admission hit worse than the confession about cheating. You don't write someone out of a public story unless you've already deleted them from your private one. You don't plan material around someone's absence unless you've already started imagining your life without them in it. I stood up and walked toward the door. This time, she didn't try to stop me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I just drove around aimlessly. Nowhere in particular, just away from everything. Every time I stopped at a red light, her words kept playing back in my head on repeat. It was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was the end of something I'd been trying to save without even realizing it was already dead. Eventually, I found myself parked at a 24-hour diner just off Highway 75. It was one of those outdated joints with torn vinyl booths and a buzzing neon sign that read "Open," like it was daring people to come inside. The place was nearly empty at this hour. Just a tired waitress wiping down counters with mechanical precision, and a trucker who was half asleep over a bowl of chili that had probably been sitting under a heat lamp for hours. I slid into a corner booth and ordered coffee that I knew I wouldn't drink. Instead, I just stared out the window, watching the world continue to move, despite the fact that mine felt like it had completely stopped. The rain had started while I was driving, soft at first, then thick and loud, slapping against the windshield like it had something urgent to say. Her voice was still playing on a loop in my head, but it wasn't the confession that kept replaying. It was that one devastating line. I didn't think you'd be there. That was it. That was the core of everything that had gone wrong between us. Not the cheating itself, not the lies, not even that smug wink she'd given to the guy in the front row. It was the planning around my absence. The quiet, calculated choice to perform without the man she married in the room. She had curated a new version of herself, one that deliberately didn't include me. I realized I didn't want to go home. By 4:15 a.m., I was still sitting in that same booth with the same cup of coffee, now cold and completely ignored. I opened my phone and scrolled aimlessly through social media, through news articles, through anything that might distract my brain from the constant replay of the night's events. Then, without really thinking about it, without any kind of plan, I typed into the search bar, "How to tell if your wife is still cheating." The articles that came up weren't particularly satisfying or revelatory, but they confirmed one thing that I needed to hear. I wasn't crazy. All those little signs I'd been dismissing, all those moments when my gut told me something was wrong, I hadn't been imagining any of it. At 8:47 a.m., after a quick shower at the gym and a drive that felt much longer than it actually was, I stepped back into my own house. Melanie was awake, sitting in the kitchen with her laptop open in front of her, pretending to scroll through emails with the kind of forced concentration that screamed guilt. Her makeup was barely touched, applied hastily like an afterthought. The TV was on but muted, with the morning news flickering silently in the background. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes searching my face for some indication of where we stood. I didn't say a word to her. I just walked straight to the bedroom and began opening drawers, pulling out clothes and essentials. She followed me, of course. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Packing," I replied without looking at her. "For what?" "I need space." Her face hardened immediately, the vulnerable act dropping away like a discarded costume. "You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted her. "I am." A long, uncomfortable silence fell between us as I continued moving around the room, gathering my things with methodical precision. Then came the shift I'd been expecting, the moment when she switched tactics. "You're overreacting," she said, her tone becoming patronizing and reasonable. "We can talk about this like adults." I zipped the duffel bag shut with more force than necessary. "You had your talk. It was on stage." "That wasn't real," she snapped, her composure finally cracking. "Those were jokes, Tyler." "And you admitted to cheating," I said, shouldering the bag. "That wasn't a joke." "You said you forgave me for that," she replied, desperation creeping into her voice. "No," I corrected her, finally making eye contact. "You told me I did." She flinched like I'd physically struck her. And in that moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Genuine panic. Not the performed emotion she used to manipulate situations, but real, raw fear about what was happening. I walked past her again, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, keys already in my hand. There was no yelling, no dramatic slamming of doors, just the quiet dissolution of a marriage following me down the hallway like a cold draft that wouldn't go away. She didn't chase after me. She didn't even try. I ended up staying with my cousin Nathan for the next 4 nights. He had a small 1-bedroom apartment with a couch that made my back ache something terrible, but he was good enough not to ask too many questions about what had happened. Nathan just handed me a beer when I showed up at his door with my duffel bag, nodded in that understanding way guys do, and turned on some game that neither of us really watched. On the 5th night, Melanie finally called. I stared at her name on my phone screen for a few rings, then let it go to voicemail. On the 6th night, she showed up at Nathan's door. She knocked twice. No doorbell, just 2 deliberate raps that somehow sounded exactly like her. When I opened the door, she looked smaller somehow, less composed than I'd ever seen her. The confident performer from that stage was nowhere to be found. "I messed up," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're blowing this up like we're strangers." I didn't reply. I just stood there in the doorway, not inviting her in but not slamming the door either. "I miss you," she added, and for a moment there was something almost genuine in her tone. I looked her straight in the eye when I responded. "I miss the version of you who wasn't lying to me." She blinked rapidly, stepping back like I'd physically slapped her across the face. Without another word, I closed the door. She didn't knock again. The next morning, I found a voicemail waiting in my inbox. Her voice was soft and rehearsed, like someone reading from a script that had been written by guilt itself. "Tyler, I get it, I really do," the message began. "I betrayed you, and that's on me. But if you still love me, if you think there's anything worth saving here, call me back. Please." I didn't delete the voicemail immediately. I kept it for a few days, not because I was considering calling her back, but because I wasn't quite ready to erase that final plea from existence. But I never called her back either. The silence between us wasn't really silence anymore. It was strategy, and I could feel her trying to wait me out. By now, I had developed a routine at Nathan's place. Wake up sore on his couch, pretend to scroll through job listings that I didn't actually need, nurse a cup of burnt coffee, and replay that night over and over in my mind. The stage lights, the audience hanging on her every word, the way her voice had dipped when she flirted through jokes about me, that smug wink, and most of all, that text from C with its smug little kiss emoji that seemed to burn brighter in my memory than anything else from that horrible night. By day 9, the silence between us wasn't silence anymore. It was strategy. I could feel her trying to wait me out, and I realized that Melanie had always been a woman who thought she could negotiate with reality. If she just waited long enough, smiled just right, cried on cue when necessary, the world would eventually bend to her will. But I wasn't bending this time, and I think that genuinely surprised her. I needed answers, real ones, not the soft, vague nonsense she'd been feeding me. Not another dismissive, "It was a mistake." If she thought she could gaslight her way back into good graces, then she really didn't know me at all. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Danny, an old friend from our college days. Danny was loud, crass, and way too obsessed with fantasy football for a man his age, but he was also fiercely loyal to the people he cared about. More importantly, he still kept tabs on everyone in our extended social circle, including mutual friends that Melanie had quietly distanced herself from once she started her whole finding herself phase. I barely got through saying hello before Danny jumped right in. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said, and I could hear the resignation in his voice. "What do you know?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Danny let out a long sigh. "You want the polite version or the real one?" "Real," I said without hesitation. "There's a guy, Blake Jensen," Danny said. "Works at her gym. Runs one of those influencer side hustles, motivational bullshit on Instagram. I've seen her in his photos." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles went white. "Photos? Yeah, in the background mostly, but they hang out a lot. And this was before that open mic crap, Tyler. Months ago. You didn't know." I said nothing, letting the information sink in like poison. Danny kept going, his voice getting more uncomfortable. "Look, man, I didn't want to interfere. I figured she'd grow out of it." I hung up before Danny could say anything more. I didn't want to hear his apologies or his justifications for keeping me in the dark. Blake, see, of course it all made sense now. I didn't confront her about Blake. Not yet. I needed to see for myself, to witness the truth with my own eyes rather than rely on secondhand information or my own mounting suspicions. That night, I drove to the gym. The same one she used to drag me to every other Thursday until she suddenly needed more solo time for her workouts. I parked across the street with the engine off, my eyes locked on the glass doors like they might somehow confess their secrets to me. It felt pathetic, sitting there like some private investigator in a bad movie, but I needed to know. I needed proof that would silence the small part of my brain that still wondered if I was overreacting. At 7:28 p.m. exactly, she walked out of the building. But she wasn't alone. Blake followed right behind her, tall, overstyled, one of those guys who probably smelled like expensive deodorant and spent more time perfecting his Instagram feed than most people spend on their actual careers. He said something to her that I couldn't hear from my position, and she laughed in response. Then they hugged. But it wasn't the kind of casual hug you give a gym buddy or a personal trainer. This was the kind that lingers, the kind where two people forget that the world is watching, where bodies press together just a little too long and hands linger on backs and shoulders. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there, frozen, and watched her climb into Blake's passenger seat like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she'd done it 100 times before, like she belonged there. That was the moment everything crystallized for me. The moment when something deep inside me snapped, not with rage or grief, but with absolute clarity. It was over. Not in the dramatic, theatrical way that people like Melanie seem to live for, with yelling and crying and grand accusations. No, it ended quietly in a parking lot under the soft buzz of a streetlight, with her sliding into another man's car like she'd rehearsed the movement. I turned the key in the ignition, pulled away from the curb, and didn't look back. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't go back to Nathan's that night. Instead, I drove to a motel on the edge of town, one of those outdated places with flickering ice machines and carpets that hadn't seen a steam cleaner since the early 2000s. I didn't need luxury or comfort. I needed silence, the kind that wrapped around your ribs and let you feel every inch of the emptiness you'd been denying for too long. The room smelled faintly of mildew and industrial-strength bleach. I dropped my duffel bag on the bed, sat down in the plastic chair by the window, and stared at my phone. Melanie hadn't texted me. She hadn't called. There wasn't even a question mark or a "where are you?" message. Nothing at all. That radio silence told me everything I needed to know. It meant she knew that I knew. Cowards don't reach out when they've been caught red-handed in the middle of their life collapsing around them. I should have felt fury. I should have wanted to storm back into that bar, onto that stage, into that moment, and scream the truth until it shattered her carefully constructed illusion. But all I felt was an overwhelming tiredness that seemed to seep into my bones. I hadn't cried, not once through this entire ordeal. Not when she confessed, not when she minimized it as nothing, not even when I watched her climb into another man's car without a shred of guilt or shame visible on her face. The crying just didn't come. Instead, there was this kind of hollowness, like the emotional version of aftershock. It felt like my heart had completely evacuated the premises and left behind only echoes of what it used to believe in. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't hesitate or second-guess myself. I didn't ask about counseling options or marriage therapy. I didn't stall or make excuses. Infidelity, I said, my voice completely even and matter-of-fact. Yes, I have proof. The woman on the other end was efficient and clinical in the way that legal professionals have to be. She asked for names, dates, documentation, anything that could support my case. I gave her everything I had. Photos of them together that Danny had mentioned, screenshots of text conversations, dates of her suspicious gym visits, even her set list from that comedy night, and the voicemail apology disguised as emotional manipulation. When the paperwork came through 3 days later, I printed the forms in the motel's tiny business center. I held those divorce papers in my hands like I was holding her obituary, like I was officially declaring the death of something that had been slowly dying for months without either of us acknowledging it. She still hadn't called by the time I made my decision, so I drove to the house one final time. I didn't send her a text warning or give her any heads up about what was coming. When she opened the front door and saw me standing there with an envelope in my hand, her face flickered through what had to be 7 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Confusion, relief, guilt, anger, and then finally settling on that thing she always leaned on when she was cornered. Fake sadness. "Tyler!" she said, blinking rapidly like she was trying to process my unexpected appearance. I held out the envelope without ceremony. She didn't take it immediately, just stared at it like it might explode in her hands. "What is this?" she asked, even though her tone suggested she already knew exactly what it was. Reality, I said simply. She looked at the envelope like it was a bomb with a ticking timer. You're not serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. You're really going to throw everything away over one mistake? She asked, and I could hear the desperation starting to creep into her voice. You didn't just cheat, I said, keeping my voice steady and controlled. You built a whole world where I was nothing more than a background character in your story. Her lip trembled, but no actual tears came. She was still performing even now. You don't mean this, she tried again, reaching for whatever manipulation might still work. I looked her dead in the eye and said something I'd been rehearsing in my head for days. I meant every I love you I ever said to you. You just didn't deserve them. I dropped the envelope on the foyer floor and walked away. Behind me, the door didn't close immediately. She just stood there in the doorway, completely silent. Maybe for the first time in her entire life, Melanie had absolutely nothing left to say. Days passed after that confrontation. She didn't contest the divorce proceedings. There was no dramatic plea, no last-minute realization, no fight whatsoever. She signed the papers and mailed them back to my lawyer like they were just another piece of junk mail, as if our entire marriage could be reduced to nothing more than a legal formality that needed to be handled efficiently. When I received the signed papers back at the motel, I just stared at the envelope for a long time. Her signature sat there in black ink, cold and practiced, with a date scribbled next to it like an afterthought. That's when something finally clicked into place for me. She'd been done with our marriage long before I knew there was even a problem. Everything started making sense in a backwards kind of way. Her constant deflections whenever I tried to have serious conversations. Her weaponized humor that turned every genuine concern into a joke. The way she kept me emotionally at arm's length while pretending to invite me closer. She'd been performing for months, maybe even years. That night on stage wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the final act of a show that had been running for way too long. And Blake? He wasn't the reason she left our marriage. He was just the excuse she used to make leaving easier on herself. The convenient scapegoat that let her rewrite history and make it seem like passion overtook her rather than admitting she'd been checking out of our relationship long before she found someone new. I decided to go back to the house one final time. Not to talk to her or attempt any kind of reconciliation. I was done with all of that. I just needed to collect the last of my belongings and officially close that chapter of my life. When I got there, her car was gone and the place felt like an empty shell of what it had once been. Our wedding photo still hung crooked above the fireplace, a framed image of two people who were already pretending they hadn't started drifting apart. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the bedroom, haunting the sheets like a bitter ghost that refused to leave. I packed the last of my things in complete silence. My books, a few more clothes, and the framed photo of my late father that Melanie had always complained didn't match the aesthetic of our home. Well, it matched mine, and that was all that mattered now. In the top drawer of her nightstand, I found something that stopped me cold. It was a card from me, still unopened, from last year's anniversary. The one she had told me she'd misplaced when I asked about it weeks later. I opened it and saw my own handwriting staring back at me, hopeful and tired at the same time. Still choosing you every day, even when it's hard, even when it hurts a little. I hope you still choose me too. She had never opened it, never even bothered to read it. I left the card sitting open on the nightstand, not out of spite, but out of truth. She could face what I'd written now, or not at all. Either way, it wasn't mine to carry anymore. On my way out of the house, I turned around one last time in the hallway, looking at this little scratch on the wall from when we'd first moved in together. It was a stupid scrape from her elbow that happened while we were carrying furniture inside. We had laughed about that mark for an entire week, turning it into some kind of inside joke between us. Now it just looked like a scar on the paint, a permanent reminder of damage that could never quite be fixed. I locked the door behind me, dropped the key in the mailbox, and walked away with absolutely no plan for what came next. But for the first time in a very long time, I also walked away with no illusions. No more performing for an audience that didn't appreciate the show. No more guessing what version of myself she wanted me to be on any given day. No more second-guessing my own instincts. Just forward movement, one step at a time. 3 weeks after I left for good, Melanie finally reached out again. This time, it was a text message, short and pointed. We need to talk in person. I stared at that message for a full minute, my thumb hovering over the screen like it might catch fire if I responded too quickly. She didn't deserve any more of my time, energy, or emotional bandwidth. She had already taken enough. my trust, my patience, my faith in what I thought we had built together. But part of me needed closure, and I realized it wasn't for her benefit. It was for mine. I needed one final chance to see everything for what it really was, stripped of all the haze and confusion that had kept me waiting for changes that were never going to come. I agreed to meet her, but only on my terms. We met at a neutral location, a cafe downtown with bright walls and too many windows. It was the kind of place people go to when they want to pretend that everything is fine, that they're just having a normal conversation between two reasonable adults. She wore sunglasses even though it was cloudy outside, and her nails were freshly done. Her hair was perfect, styled like she was heading to a photo shoot rather than a difficult conversation with her soon-to-be ex-husband. She looked like someone who desperately wanted to regain control of a situation that had completely spiraled beyond her ability to manipulate. I sat down across from her without smiling, without offering any pleasantries. I didn't speak first. I just waited to see what kind of performance she had prepared for this final act. She started the conversation exactly the way I expected her to. "I've been thinking," she said, adjusting her sunglasses like they were some kind of shield. "About us. About everything that happened." I waited, giving her nothing to work with. "I made a mistake," she continued, "but you made it easy." That was her opening line. After everything we'd been through, after all the lies and betrayal, that's how she chose to begin this conversation. "Easy?" I asked, genuinely curious to see where she was going with this. "You stopped seeing me," she said, leaning forward slightly. "You were always tired, always working, always distracted. I felt invisible." I took a slow breath, processing what she was trying to do. "So you cheated." "I felt abandoned," she replied, as if that justified everything. "And instead of telling me that, you climbed into someone else's bed." She looked away from me, unable to maintain eye contact. "I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did." I actually laughed at that. Not loud, but with a bitter edge that surprised even me. "You planned everything. The lies, the stories, even the jokes you made about me on stage." Melanie leaned forward, trying a different approach. "You think this was easy for me?" "I think it was easier than fixing what we had," I said without hesitation. Silence fell between us like a heavy curtain. Outside, I could hear a bus hissing to a stop, its doors clattering open to let passengers on and off. Normal life continuing while we sat here dissecting the remains of our marriage. "I didn't come here to fight," she said eventually, her voice softer now. "No," I replied, finally understanding what this meeting was really about. "You came here hoping I'd still be the man who forgives you." Her carefully composed expression cracked then, but not from sadness or regret. It was irritation, pure and simple. She was annoyed that her usual tactics weren't working. "So what, you're just done? That's it?" she asked, and I could hear the frustration building in her voice. "I was done the night I saw you laughing with him," I said. "The night you made a joke out of me and didn't even have the decency to look sorry about it." Melanie leaned back in her chair, and I could see that the performance was finally over. The actress had run out of material, and there was nothing left to act. "You're not as innocent as you think," she muttered, her mask completely dropped now. "I never claimed to be perfect," I said, standing up and reaching for my wallet. "But I never left the marriage. You did, repeatedly." I stood up from the table and tossed a few bills down, even though I hadn't ordered anything. She didn't try to stop me as I walked out into the gray morning air. A strange sense of peace settled over me as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Not because it didn't hurt anymore, because it still did, deeply, but because I finally realized something important. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her reasons or her justifications. I didn't need her at all. I just needed to keep walking, one step and then the next, until her voice became nothing more than a distant memory that was too far away to cause any real pain. The days that followed felt cleaner somehow. Not easier exactly, but honest in a way that I hadn't experienced in months. The lies weren't there anymore to wrestle with. The gaslighting had finally stopped. The emotional acrobatics, the constant wondering, the second-guessing of my own instincts. All of it was gone. In their place was a kind of aching clarity, like sunlight streaming through a house after fires had burned it completely hollow. It hurt, but it was a clean hurt, the kind that meant healing was actually possible. I moved into a small rental house outside the city, a quiet place tucked behind a row of pine trees. There were no shared closets, no ghostly traces of her perfume, just pure, uninterrupted silence. The kind of silence that didn't scream at me or remind me of everything she'd taken from me. I didn't talk about her much after that. When Nathan asked how I was doing, I just shook my head and changed the subject. When my sister called to check in, I deflected her questions. Not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. I was done keeping Melanie's story alive in my mouth, done giving her any more space in my thoughts than she'd already occupied. But then, just when I thought I was finally free of her, she tried one more time. A manila envelope showed up in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter in her familiar looping script, folded neatly like it was supposed to be some kind of sacred document. The letter read, "Tyler, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to write back. But I need you to know something. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about me feeling small and unseen for too long. You were always reliable, but never really there. I felt like a roommate, not a wife. And Blake, it wasn't love, it was attention. I was desperate and I did something awful. I own that. But I want to thank you for the years you gave me, for the steadiness, for choosing me even when I didn't deserve it. I hope you find someone who actually knows how to hold that. I wasn't her. I see that now." Mel. I read that letter once, then read it again, trying to process her attempt at insight and accountability. Then I tore it in half. Not out of anger or spite, but because it simply didn't belong to me anymore. Her guilt wasn't mine to carry. Her belated self-awareness had come too late to matter, like a rescue ship showing up long after the wreck had already sunk to the bottom of the ocean. I tossed the pieces into the trash and took a long walk. The kind that stretches for hours and doesn't lead anywhere in particular. Just movement for the sake of movement. Just being somewhere other than where I'd been. The next day, I booked a solo trip to Vermont. Just a weekend getaway, hiking trails, quiet inns, fog rolling in over the mountains. I picked somewhere with no phone signal, somewhere she had never touched or even talked about visiting. I needed a place that existed completely outside of our shared history. On the second morning of that trip, as I stood at the edge of a cliff watching the sun rise over the valley below, I felt something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. It wasn't joy or triumph or any kind of dramatic emotion. It was relief. The soft, sacred release of finally letting go of someone who was never meant to be held that tightly in the first place. When I returned from Vermont, something fundamental had changed inside me. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. There were no big declarations or symbolic moments, but it was real and undeniable. I started waking up without that familiar knot in my stomach. I stopped flinching every time my phone buzzed with a notification. The air felt a little less heavy, and the days felt a little less haunted by memories I couldn't escape. Healing doesn't come with fanfare or announcements. It's quiet and subtle, like the slow retreat of a storm that had once felt permanent and overwhelming. You don't notice it happening until one day you realize the thunder has stopped and the rain has moved on. I went back to the routines I used to find boring before everything fell apart. Morning runs through the neighborhood, grocery shopping without having to account for someone else's preferences, reading in bed with a lamp on, staying up as late as I wanted. But now these simple activities were mine again, unshared, unburdened by the need to consider anyone else's mood or schedule or silent disapproval. A few friends reached out cautiously over the following weeks, offering drinks, conversations, space to vent about what I'd been through. But I wasn't ready for that yet. I was still in the process of reassembling myself piece by piece, and some pieces were missing entirely. Not because Melanie had taken them, but because I'd handed them over willingly, too often and for too long. I needed time to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to be what someone else needed me to be. One evening, while I was organizing old boxes that had been sitting in storage, I found a photo I hadn't seen in years. It was a picture of Melanie and me from the early days of our relationship, a blurry selfie taken at some corn maze we'd visited during one of those perfect autumn weekends. Our cheeks were flushed from the cold air, and her head was resting on my shoulder. At first glance, we looked happy together. But now, staring at that image with the clarity that only comes from distance and heartbreak, I realized something strange and unsettling. I looked genuinely happy in that photo, relaxed, content, unguarded. But she looked staged, even back then. Her eyes were tilted toward the camera rather than focused on the moment. Her smile was picture perfect, and her posture was posed just so. Even in those early days, she had been performing, and I had mistaken that performance for love. That photo went straight into the trash, not out of bitterness or anger, but because it was a souvenir from a place that had never truly existed in the first place. Later that same week, Melanie sent me one final email. The subject line simply read, "Closure." I stared at that message in my inbox for a long moment, my cursor hovering over it. Then, without opening it, I deleted it completely. Whatever she had to say in that email, it was hers to keep now. Real closure didn't come from hearing her confess more details, or justify her actions, or reflect on what went wrong between us. Closure came from not needing any of that anymore. It came from reaching a place where her words, whether they were apologies, explanations, or attempts at manipulation, simply didn't matter to me anymore. I deleted that email without ceremony, just a single click, and it was gone in 1 second. That felt like the cleanest break of all, the moment when the final thread connecting us snapped without making any noise at all. There were no more letters after that. No more texts or surprise visits. No more fake apologies wrapped in nostalgia or attempts to rewrite history. It was finally, completely over. Not in the theatrical, dramatic sense that people like Melanie seem to live for, but in the way a season ends quietly, completely, and irrevocably. 8 weeks later, I moved into a better apartment. Nothing fancy or expensive, just a place with light wood floors, clean lines, and a window that faced east so I could watch the sunrise each morning. I bought furniture that I actually liked, not the beige, compromised pieces we'd always argued over when we were trying to blend our tastes. I hung art on the walls that spoke to me, picked out new dishes that made me smile, and started cooking again. Really cooking. Not just heating up frozen meals or ordering takeout because I was too emotionally drained to care about nourishing myself properly. These were small acts of self-ownership, but they felt monumental after years of compromise and negotiation over every little decision. Slowly, I began to realize that I was no longer waiting for the pain to stop. It had already passed, not because it had stopped hurting, but because the hurt no longer matched who I was becoming. One afternoon, I bumped into a former mutual friend at the grocery store. Taylor was someone Melanie used to hang out with when she wanted to feel sophisticated and worldly. We made polite small talk, the kind of conversation that dances carefully on the edge of truth without ever falling into it. Then Taylor asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you ever think about going back?" I looked up from my shopping cart, paused for a moment, and then smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile or a smug one. It was just the expression of someone who had finally found peace with their decision. "No," I said simply. "I don't miss who I had to be to stay." That night, I sat alone on my couch with my legs up, soft jazz music playing in the background. Something smooth and wordless that filled the space without demanding attention. I held a glass of something good, not the cheap stuff I used to buy when I was trying to save money for things that we needed. I watched the city lights blink slowly outside my window, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt completely at peace. It wasn't loneliness that I was experiencing. It was genuine peace. There was no dramatic conclusion to my story, no final phone call where everything was resolved, no grand confrontation where I got to say everything I'd been holding back. Just the quiet understanding that the person I had once trusted most in the world had become a stranger wearing a familiar face. And that letting go of her wasn't a loss. It was a rescue. A rescue from a version of myself that had been shrinking to accommodate someone else's needs, someone else's moods, someone else's definition of what our relationship should look like. From that point forward, every decision was mine again. Every quiet morning when I could drink my coffee in silence without walking on eggshells. Every book I could leave half-finished on the nightstand without having to explain why I'd lost interest. Every moment I didn't have to justify, shrink myself, or sacrifice what I wanted for the sake of keeping someone else happy. I had survived her betrayal, and more importantly, I had survived her. In doing so, I had found the one thing she had never truly offered me. Not really, not in any genuine way. I had found myself again.